Uh, Hi, today we will be discussing about the Spring security. Um, we all know that Spring and Spring Boot are very good frameworks for developing applications, and it also provides inbuilt security features. Spring Security is a powerful, highly customizable framework. It provides authentication and authorization for Java applications. So by default, when Spring Security is included as a dependency in a Spring Boot, a web application, it provides the default security configuration, right? The default user with a randomly generated password printed on warning level logs upon application startup. Okay, and there are different ways we can provide authentication. You can see there are four options. Spring Boot security supports various authentication mechanisms. So first thing is in-memory authentication. You can just define the users and their credentials directly in application configuration. In-memory means you will just provide the user ID and password in a configuration file, security configuration file in the application. You are not storing in the database, right? That is why we call it as a in-memory authentication. And other thing is the database authentication. Sometimes we need to store the user ID password details in a database, not in an application level, right? So for that we use the database authentication. Spring Security uses the database authentication. And sometimes we need third-party directories, which will control the access management, like LDAP authentication, right? So for that we need to integrate LDAP authentication with the directories. Using Spring Security is also possible. And OAuth and SAML support for external identity providers. So we all know OAuth 2 is a very good Spring Boot authentication framework, security framework. Nowadays most of the companies they are using OAuth 2 security authentication framework. So authorization is nothing but allowing giving access to particular resources based on roles and permissions. So this also can be handled using URL based authorization, securing specific URL patterns, method level security. There are a couple of annotations we can use annotations like @pre-authorize and @post-authorize to control access to methods. It is also possible. We can also implement the authorization as well as authentication. Both are important, right? First thing is you need to authenticate whether the user is valid or not, whether the identity of the user is valid or not. We have to identify using authentication mechanism. Authorization means once the user is allowed to identified, we need to verify the access permission and the roles that were given to particular user to access certain resources. And customization, right? The Spring Boot provides default as well as customizable Spring Security. Either we can use by default security configurations, or we can customize the security configuration. That thing we will see in the code, couple of scripts, right? I will explain that. This is simplified configuration. By default security, you just need to include a Spring Boot starter security dependency. So as soon as you include the starter security dependency, it will ask you the user ID and password. You will get those user ID password while starting the application at the logs level. So that is the default security configuration. You see here I am using so they mentioned an example for in-memory authentication. So we need to create a configuration class. We should annotate with the @configuration annotation, and then see we need three beans. So you see first thing is password encoder. Why we need it? For encoding the password, generally we require this. Other thing is user detail service. Here we need to provide the user and password and role for a particular the user. So here see, we are creating user detail service, and then we are using builder pattern, and there we are setting all these username, password, and inside the password we are using password encoder for encoding the password, right? So that it will not be visible to anybody, right? And the role also we are providing user or admin. We created two users, one is user and other admin, and then we are returning in memory user details manager. We need to pass the user object and well as admin objects, both objects to in memory user details manager. So that way user details service will have these both users, user details and passwords. And a security filter, see, we need to authorize whenever we are trying to access particular API, we need to authorize particular endpoint. So we have to specify the matchers whenever the request is coming for this particular admin, or user. You see, they have the roles. We are just authorizing here. Authorize HTTP request, and we are just creating authorization, making sure if this particular user is having a role admin, and then you can authorize, you can allow that request, right? So you can see form permit all and logout permit all. So this is basic the security, and I want to show you how the database configuration. We have seen it here in the user detail service. We just hard coded the details, but these details are not stored in database, right? So what we have to do here, we have to store the user ID and password details. So that is why what I am doing, I am just going Spring Boot security with the database authentication example. Let's see how it will be. We need an example, right? Okay, let us take this example. Here you can see here. So we have to write a custom user service details. Earlier it was the directly we hard coded there with the user detail service, but now we need to create a customized user service details. So for that, what we are doing, we are implementing user service details here. We need to implement that, and after that we need to override the load user by username. You see, it is taking username, and then we are sending see, we are setting the username and password details from the database, not from the we are not hard coded here. Okay, so you can see here the authentication provider, user repository. Assume you have a user repository which will fetch the user ID details, right? And now we created a user repository. So user repository dot find by username, right? When the user enter his username, so we will pass that username and get the user details, and we will return those user details. I mean, password must be encoded. So we will get both user ID and password. Based on that, we will verify that. So that way the user details will be validated here, right? So here, whenever you want to customize the user details, you want to store user details, passwords, you need to create a separate user detail service. You have to implement the user detail service, and from there you need to override load user by username method, right? That way you can customize the user detail service. So that is what it is mentioned here. What is that we are doing here? You can see the steps: project setup, second database schema, schema, we are creating entity, users entity, table, username, password, enabled columns, and authorities table. Authorities table, we have authorities table, we have username and authority columns. So user entity and repository, as I told you, user entity, a class that maps to users table, which will have username and password, enabled columns, right? And custom user detail service class. So as I told you, we need to create a custom user detail service implementation. This service is responsible for loading user details from the database based on the provided username. As I told you, that is what we do here, right? Implement the load user by username method, querying the user repository to retrieve user data and constructing the user details, right? We are just fetching the user detail based on the username input given by the user, and fetching all the user details, and we are building the user, right? And password encoder is required. Generally the bean is a predefined bean. We use that generally for encoding the details. We use the @configuration, @enable web security annotations. We need them because we override the security filter chain method. We have seen this in earlier, because we need to pass this object of user detail service for that inside the security filter chain. Okay, so here we are just seeing only the custom user details. So you can see here how it injected in security filter. Okay, want to see that option also. Let me show you. Okay, it's loading. So now you see, this is a custom user details service method. Now what we have to do, we created the custom user detail service, and we need to inject that service for the main security config class, right? Here, if you see here, we have created DAO authenticator provider. There is a method. We need to create this bean as well. So inside this method, what we are doing, and we are just creating DAO authentication provider object, and for that we need to pass this custom user detail service object, right? That way we will get the authentication provider object. Getting it right, we will get the authentication provider object. It will authorize and authenticate user ID, username and password details properly. And security filter, you can see here we are authorizing anything endpoint coming with the public /public/*, we are permitting all those endpoints, right? So this is how you can actually customize the user ID details, and you can use the details from the database rather than hard-coded details as in-memory security, right? You can see here DAO authentication provider. Inside DAO authentication provider, we are passing the custom user detail service object. That way, whenever the user enters the user ID and password, those details will be verified from the database, and it will be authenticated this way. Okay, so that is the option. And the latest security thing, I want to show you that one as well. Spring Security OAuth 2 example. So this is the latest security and model that most of the application developer, they follow this method, and then they follow this option. So whenever we want to use any OAuth security, there are a couple of OAuth providers like Google, GitHub. We need to create a client ID, and we will get a client ID and client secret, right? When you create it. in that particular provider. So once you registered with those provider, you will get a client ID and client secret, right? You need to mention those client ID and client secret in application.properties file, right? You need to include these dependencies as well, this starter, Spring Boot starter web, Spring Boot starter security, Spring Boot starter WAUth to client, Spring Boot starter timely for used for UI purpose, user interface purpose. So WAUth to client dependency and starter security client. Starter security, starter WAUth to client, these two are important, right? Basically, whenever you want to utilize this. And also, see, if you want to use a GitHub, you need to provide GitHub client ID and client secret. Now, we need to define the security config here. See, you have to define the security config. Here what we are doing, WAUth2, we are using .WAUth2 login and WAUth2. You see, we created WAUth2 functional programming style, and whenever you are accessing home, it will redirect to the login page. So we are redirecting that to login page, and you see it is a home. Here there is a annotation authentication principle, WAUth2 user and WAUth2 user. There are a couple of annotation directly provided here with the Spring Boot, so you don't need to do much things here, right? That way you will be redirected to the WAUth2 provider page, and you will enter those details. Automatically the control will come back to your application once the successful login happened. This is a high level thing, so it is, we just used a default this authentication principle annotation here. You can see here for WAUth2 user, but you can also customize it in enterprise grade applications. We can implement a very complex security mechanism also, but for high level, WAUth2 is a more secure practice that most of the application developer they use for building this security, for integrating the Spring security to the client. So Spring is very good for with rich set of security features and all. And thank you for listening.